Well, we're starting on a new section that I have labeled at the top Anarchism, or probably more appropriately Anarchisms. Anarchism kind of has a bad name, and yet there's a good reason why I want to explore different anarchist ideas nonetheless. And actually, we've already run into a couple of people who have been called anarchists. Chris Hedges, who actually calls himself a Christian anarchist, and Jacques Ellul, who's been labeled as such by others. I don't believe he took that moniker for himself. And I think I mentioned, at least with Hedges in passing, that he had identified himself in that way. But the reason why I say anarchism has a bad name is because it's often associated in the popular imagination with just complete disorder. Anarchy, for instance, conjures up in the mind total chaos of a violent nature usually, and anarchism and anarchists are imagined as people who are more or less destructive, trying to break down social order. Now, surely there are people in the past as well as the present who embrace that type of anarchism, a sort of violent anarchism that wants to break down existing order and do it in a way regardless of other people's safety. But anarchism is a whole lot more than that. I went out on the internet to find different definitions of anarchism from different sources, just to kind of show you the variety of conceptions of anarchism, actually. So, first of all, from Wikipedia, which is where everybody goes first these days, anarchism, it's a pretty good definition, too. It says, anarchism is a political philosophy that advocates self-governed societies based on voluntary institutions. These are often described as stateless societies, although several authors have defined them more specifically as institutions based on non-hierarchical or free associations. Now, that definition right there should make you pause if what you've had in your mind about anarchism and anarchy is complete disorder and violence, because we see here this idea of self-government, self-governed societies. There's a notion within anarchism that human beings are social creatures, and that therefore they can and should organize themselves without having a top-down approach of imposing order on them. So that's what this means by self-governed societies based on voluntary institutions. It's a bottom-up type of thinking about how to organize people. And we'll see that coming out in what we're reading for this week in Permaculture, Bill Mollison, and then when we'll listen to Holmgren, who was Mollison's partner in permaculture crime. Both of them very enamored with the idea that bigger institutions of government as well as of business have kind of failed people, and that people need to more or less organize themselves irregardless of these bigger institutions. Also, I like about this definition its emphasis on non-hierarchical associations. Generally, anarchists don't like hierarchy, as you can imagine, because hierarchy leads to these very big institutions of power that tend to overwhelm the freedom of both the individual and the smaller group. From the Stanford Encyclopedia we have, anarchism is a political theory which is skeptical of the justification of authority and power, especially political power. This was expressed very early on in the disagreement between Karl Marx, who was a communist, of course, an advocate of communism, and Mikhail Bakunin, who was an anarchist communist. Bakunin disagreed with Marx and the Marxists about the usefulness of using the available political system to try to obtain a communist state. Whereas Marxists argued that any means should and could be used, and particularly advocated the use of the political system to try to gain power within that system in order to overtake it. Bakunin And the people who followed him in anarchism basically didn't think that that was a fruitful avenue, because they thought that eventually it would just lead back to state power, which I guess in hindsight they were kind of right about that if we look at the history of the Soviet Union and other communist states. But of course, whether any sort of human organization doesn't ultimately end up having that kind of power, if it becomes an effective system, is a question that somebody like Bakunin couldn't answer. And that gets to the heart of whether anarchism ultimately is viable. Can human beings organize in smaller self-governing societies without that organization increasing and then more or less morphing into state power eventually? Is that a natural part of human development, or can we avoid it? Finally, we have a definition from Webster's dictionary, a political theory. Anarchism is a political theory holding all forms of governmental authority to be unnecessary and undesirable, and advocating a society based on voluntary cooperation and free association of individuals and groups. And I might take the occasion to just mention that there's some kinship between anarchism and libertarianism, and you can see it in that particular definition. A very thoroughgoing libertarian doesn't have hardly any use at all for governmental authority, and believes that people can govern themselves and can interact with each other in a voluntary fashion and more or less enforce order through their interactions and reactions to each other. Anarchists tend to focus more on the development of organic voluntary communities than libertarians, who tend to have a more individualistic mindset, but that varies. So there's some overlap there. The word anarchism comes from anarchia, Greek for without authority, or the absence of government. And as such, it can mean, of course, the attitude that we don't need government at all, that we need to live completely free of government and completely voluntarily, but also in practice it encompasses certain types of cooperation that are designed to bypass or not depend upon the existing reigning government and economic institutions. And I would put Mollison and Holmgren into that category. They're not talking about, dismantling existing government institutions, or even they're not even talking necessarily about replacing them, except for maybe into the distant future. But they're talking about what people can do now to organize and take care of themselves regardless of the existing government and economic institutions. I think Chris Hedges would basically see the world the same way. He knows that for the foreseeable future we're going to have both government and corporate power and all of that stuff that he was complaining about. And through his criticism, he's going to try to get people to see those things and reject them, but he also spends a good deal of time talking about what people can and should do towards their neighbors and towards the environment and so on, regardless of government and what it says and does. So here are some of the people that we've encountered or will encounter in the class. Mollison, Holmgren, of course. We also have in this particular week an interview with Jack Spirko of the Survival Podcast, who is a kind of libertarian/right anarchist. We have a little piece from the classic anarchist, Henry David Thoreau. We're going to meet in the future John Zerzan, who's an anarcho-primitivist. And then we have Noam Chomsky, who has been called an anarcho-syndicalist. So if you're starting to get confused about all these anarchisms, don't worry about it too much. We'll be covering these ideas in more depth. But part of the reason why I'm spending so much time on this in this class is because we've entered into a period of time, I think everybody can agree on this, where the traditional left and right wing, that is the, say, the Democrat and the Republican Party in the United States, have come to be seen as inadequate to the challenge, and in fact seem to be somewhat on the decline or disintegration. There's a great deal of confusion in the Republican Party right now about what it even stands for. It's factionalizing, and the Democratic Party as well doesn't seem to be able to get its footing. And I think that, you hear over and over again the dissatisfaction on the part of constituents in the United States towards both parties. And I think this is partly why we had this, in the recent election, this upsurge of dissatisfaction that led to the election of a non-traditional candidate in Donald Trump. And we see similar movements of dissatisfaction and frustration going on in Europe for a variety of reasons. And so anarchism has always been very much on the fringe, especially of American politics, not taken seriously, but of late, and especially in the younger generations, anarchism is getting another hearing and is being spoken of more and more. And some of the older thinkers, some of the more authoritative people who have espoused anarchism in the past are being brought back up and paid attention to again. And they do propose outside of the box ideas and solutions. Ultimately, whether we want some form of anarchism or not, we may be able to learn from these people who think outside the box, something that we couldn't learn if we thought about these problems that we're studying simply from the traditional sort of left-right partisan politics competition mentality. So basically, I'm trying to follow where our society is actually going. And these ideas are sort of bubbling up to the surface, and they're nascent, and they may become something more. And I think it's worth taking a good long look at them, especially since they deal so much with the subject of this course, environmental problems, food system problems. So I wanted to spend some time talking about permaculture. I had you listen to Holmgren, and I had you read Mollison, a couple of selections from the designer's manual that he came up with, and I think it was published in 1970, the first edition of it. Holmgren is the younger of the two. Mollison passed a couple years ago, I believe, but Holmgren's interview is really good, and it really updates what's said and the sort of the theory that is exposed in the designer's manual. Mollison and Holmgren tend to come from the left, although it's a different kind of left, and it doesn't fit within the traditional political spectrum. Jack Spirko tends to come from the right, but one of the things that I found interesting about the Spirko interview, and the reason why I assigned it, is because in a lot of ways he does see the world differently. For instance, he's much more attracted to the value and power of competition, but he's in full agreement with people like Mollison and Holmgren on the necessity of people to localize, to work together, to do without money and without external inputs in what they produce as much as possible. There's an emphasis on both on the part of all of them, of the idea of a different type of independence and a different type of wealth, and I found that interesting. So I hope you do too. So I thought, rather than going through every little piece of Mollison's chapters, which I assigned for this week, I would take a step back, and I will hit some of the more important points that I don't get to with this particular stepping back maneuver, but I wanted to step back first and just talk about permaculture generally, because it may be the first time that you've ever encountered this. Many students in this class don't have a farming background. Even if you do have a farming background, you may not have heard of permaculture. And yet it is a growing concern. More and more permaculture farming is coming up, both of the backyard nature, of course, but also bigger enterprises that are attempting to use permaculture. The name kind of gives away at a very basic level what permaculture is about, because it's a combination of the terms permanent and agriculture. Now, that takes some unpacking too. I kind of liken this to to the way things used to be before agriculture. No, I don't want to confuse you, but in my mind, I think back to the way people fed themselves before they engaged in agriculture, which was the hunting-gathering way. And at that point, of course, we had far fewer people, but what we had is an environment that fed us. Sometimes it was precarious, and I think this is one of the main reasons why agriculture was developed, is that nature provides in abundance at some points, and then at others, due to a drought or due to a forest fire or something like that, it doesn't. And so human beings, of course, wanted to develop more control over their food supply. But during good times, in the hunter-gatherers, for instance, of the United States, before it became the United States, the Native Americans were hunter-gatherers, and they could find enough to eat. In other words, just from the land, through going out and eating finding the native plants, berries, tubers, and of course hunting for various animals. They didn't have to plant anything. They didn't have to cultivate. They could move if they wanted to, as long as it was to a place where they could hunt, fish, and gather food that was growing around them. Now, when you think about it, then all of nature was kind of like their farm or their garden, and it regulated itself. Things grew up from the seeds that fell to the earth because of the winter killed off what remained. Plants then basically die down. They drop their seeds. Their seeds sit on the surface. The snow and the rain push them a little bit into the ground. They get the right temperature and all that stuff that is likely to make them grow up again, and sure enough, they grow up again. The dead stuff that's fallen down becomes mulch. It eventually becomes humus. It feeds all the little critters that are under the ground. So nature fertilizes itself. Nature cultivates itself. It composts itself. It reseeds. And then it grows, and then people and other creatures can come along and eat what grows, and it would still, there's enough left over, not to go into gruesome details, but when critters eat seeds, they poop them out the other end with enough fertilizer to make them grow even better the next time. Okay, enough said of that. I hope I made you laugh. But you see, nature didn't always need us to be able to support animals and people. It didn't need people to do agriculture. But as populations grew, as people became better and better at making and using tools, of course, it began to occur to them to control their environment more and to start doing regular agriculture. But however, we can still learn from the way things used to be, and I think that's a key insight of permaculture, is to realize that nature can do a lot of the work for you. Permaculture people tend to think that the less work you do, the better, which when you think about it sounds pretty attractive. So a big idea in permaculture is that you should pay attention to your area that you live in and where you're going to grow things, and see what grows there naturally, and see if you can use those, and whether you can maybe even encourage some of those native plants that are edible that you can use. And even for the plants that don't grow right in your area naturally, then pay attention to what you plant that actually does really well in your area, in your particular soil, and then keep growing that and things like that. Pay attention to what parts of your land these things grow in and like, and don't try to force them into areas where you have to add a lot of fertilizer or some sort of amendment because the ground just doesn't like to grow this type of thing. So that's what I mean by working with the terrain, but also they talk a lot about watching the way the water flows and seeing if you can use that. See if there are places in the land where you can create some way of catching the water and holding it rather than having it run off. So permaculturists are not for just leaving everything completely alone. They think that human beings should work with what they've got and enhance it and make it as productive as possible. And so finding different ways to catch water, whether it's creating some sort of berms or terraces where water can remain in the soil instead of flowing away, or whether it's catching rain in rain barrels or something like that. They're all for that. They also talk about reducing work by making sure that you position your plants and animals on any farm or settlement so that you have ease of access. Think about what you'll use every day. For instance, you probably want your chickens fairly close to your house because you're going to be going out there every single day and grabbing their eggs. You want your kitchen garden close to your house so that you can run right out and grab yourself a tomato and some beans or lettuce. But if you're growing grains, for instance, to feed your animals or to make bread, make flour to make bread or something like that, those are crops that grow for a long time and you harvest them maybe once or twice a year to use, and so you don't need them to be as close. And then you may have trees that bear apples that bear for a period of time once a year. Those can be on the outskirts. So they don't have any hard and fast rules about these things, but they basically say before you start designing, before you start planning and changing what's around you, to think about what will suit you in your daily tasks so that you're not running all over the place, back and forth, wasting a lot of time and potentially energy. Other big ideas of permaculture include using as few external inputs as possible. So, for instance, instead of going and buying fertilizer, you would take the animal feces, you would take the scraps from your own, cooking, you would take the refuse from the crops that you grow that aren't eaten by the animals, and you compost them. You put them together into a big pile, basically, and let them rot down, and they create compost, which then you can put back into your garden, and that's the best fertilizer possible. It takes time, though, and you have to get it started. It can take as much as a year, depending on how you do it, to cook compost. So taking advantage of natural cycles and symbiotic relationships is another big idea of permaculture. Joel Salatin, who you met a little bit earlier in this course, is a very big believer in moving animals around on a farm so that they can fertilize areas and clean them free of bugs and feed themselves in the process. So he has a chicken tractor that he puts his chickens into. It's a great big chicken wire contraption on wheels, and he moves it from one place to the other in his fields, and the chickens go about taking care of a lot of the insects that might otherwise prey upon his vegetables. And yes, chickens eat a little bit of vegetation, but if there's lots of juicy bugs around, they much prefer them, and so he takes advantage of that. And while they're at it, they're pooping all over, fertilizing the same area. Same thing with cows. He says you've got to rotate cattle through various areas, and they will do the same thing. They keep down excessive vegetation, and they poop out onto the ground, and then actually he sends his chickens in to deal with the maggots and and bugs that are starting to get all over the cow poop. So again, I'm probably grossing you out or maybe making you laugh, but these are the types of natural cycles that the farmer of old basically took advantage of. And Salatin and people like Mollison and Holmgren, they want to kind of turn that into a knowledge base, like a science. I hate to use the term science, I don't think they would either, but they want to make this as this type of thing as intentional and useful as possible. Another big idea of permaculture is to rely on money less and people more. So you pick that up, I'm sure, in Mollison's writings, that he much prefers people to exchange services with each other. For instance, childcare, There are some people in my neighborhood who are trading back and forth on childcare, so they don't have to hire somebody else they don't know to take care of their kids. They've created a cooperative system where everybody can get to work and still have their kids taken care of by each other, somebody that they know, and they don't have to pay for it. If we don't use as much money, we don't need to make as much money, and so we have more time. And also, if we don't use as much money, what money we make becomes real profit. One of the things that you'll see in Mollison's book is he says a lot of farmers never get out of debt. They don't really make much profit. If you look at their balance sheets, what profit they make is oftentimes sucked up with debt, as well as the various things that they have to buy to keep this larger agricultural model going on their farm. But a permaculturalist could, he says, have no debt and have to buy far fewer inputs like big machinery, artificial fertilizer, pesticide applications, big tillers, etc. And so what he does sell, or what she sells, then becomes real profit because she doesn't have to pay nearly as much out. So that profit can then be used to obtain things that people want that will make their lives easier, or just to give them added financial security. Permaculturalists advocate returning to smaller and more sufficient communities, self-sufficient communities. I think I've already discussed that. More informal exchange of goods and services, and more sharing. Yes, I've talked about, sharing childcare, or maybe, sharing various harvesting times where people come together and harvest each other's fields or help each other can stuff and stuff like that. But also, they advocate actually sharing land, not having to have real rigid boundaries. This is my land, not your land. Sharing tools so that everybody doesn't have to buy the same thing and supply themselves with the same thing. And of course, sharing time with each other in exchanging knowledge, giving advice, fixing things because you have the expertise to do so, and etc. So permaculture can sound pretty old-fashioned in a way, and it can be kind of hard for people to wrap their minds around, well, how could that possibly happen? And how could it happen in a way where we don't feel like we're going backwards, but instead we're going forwards? And I think that this is probably the hardest sell for the permaculturalists, and yet they do have a lot of ideas that are not simply backward looking. They do look back, and they try to gain wisdom from what people used to do and how they used to do it, but they are forward looking as well. And so in the next segment, I want to talk about Holmgren's interview. David Holmgren was the co-founder of permaculture with Mollison, and he talks a lot about what to do in energy descent, as he puts it. And so I think I'll make another lecture to deal with Holmgren and also with Spirko, and finally the Obsessives urban farming video.